Yeah, for this episode, I know it's been a while. I wanted to talk about the state of film. And, I think this has been on the tip of everyone's tongue for the last couple of years, like why film really isn't working as a medium anymore and why aren't we seeing so many good movies that we used to see. I wanted to talk about some things that I haven't seen people talk about. Everyone mentions the rise in superhero movies, franchises, the sort of constraints on budgets, also the rise in cancel culture, which we're going to get into later. But I think there's a set of sort of decisions and tropes that a lot of filmmakers make that are actually also to blame in terms of why movies aren't really working as well as they used to. I think it's important to kind of do a brief overview of the history of where Hollywood was and where it is now, because I think some of the solutions lie in that history. And also, there's a lot of people that have kind of covered this in the past. People like, Tarantino has done a good job of this. Bret Easton Ellis, the writer, he talks about a lot of this on his podcast. But prior to the 1970s, there was what you would call like the Hays Code era, which was a lot of these films were made under the guidelines of this sort of self-censorship by Hollywood. And following that, you had this sort of emergence of this new Hollywood generation, the post-Hays Code generation. These are people like Scorsese, Paul Schrader, Brian De Palma, Robert Altman. And what made these guys unique is one, they were able to really tackle a lot of this salacious content, but they were able to also incorporate, morally ambiguous characters, storylines that wouldn't necessarily give the audience what they want, but would give them maybe what they need in terms of an artistic vision. They were really able to operate as auteurs in their own right. Following that, you had the 80s, which, Tarantino famously says is one of the worst eras of Hollywood. Following that, you kind of had a revival. You had a lot of people like PTA and Tarantino himself, Robert Rodriguez, a lot of these directors that looked back on New Hollywood as a reference guide and a way to make films and used that as inspiration. So you had this great run of 90s films. And really, I think, we kind of lived on the fumes of that up until about maybe 2014, 2013. It's hard to kind of pinpoint when films gradually started getting worse. And a lot of people have talked about why does movie making around that time period start to not be as good? And I think there is kind of a litany of reasons. One, and this is something that we'll get into further, which is in some ways there was a large political angle in art, namely a didactic one that was meant to service and kind of buttress a particular political view. And this was seen in the artistic world as maybe a shortcut to making a great piece of work, or at least it was said to. I always kind of think back to what Camille Paglia said about didactic art. I know people are going to get on my case about saying this, but I really don't think politics has any room in art making. And the reason why I say this is politics is itself a reductive, it's a reductive force. It's meant to essentially reduce life's possibilities in service of like practical applications and tangible plans, which can be good when you're trying to run politics. That's great. You have to reduce certain parts of life in order to achieve something. You have to have a speed limit. You have to do this. You have to do that. You have to limit the liberties of the individual in order to achieve a goal or to have a civilization at all. But when that's incorporated into art, I think that it does kind of the exact opposite of what art is really meant to do, which art is an expansive process. It expands the possibilities of human life. And what that ultimately means is in order to be expansive, to think beyond the realms of what is going on here and now, you have to involve difficult and unsavory positions and people and approach things that are truthful, but are, you know, probably unlikable and politically incorrect. And I'm going to get into this later. That's not to say that you make art that is just intentionally inflammatory and that's going to be good. That can be its own set of issues, which we'll get into later. But back to my point, there was I think around 2013, 2014, there was this large influx of politically motivated art, which in a way was didactic and was incredibly kind of stale and came off as boring. Another thing I think that needs to be said is, because the establishment sort of had this mutually agreed upon set of values when it came to political art, it gave artists a template to then make a career, but it was an uninspired and a lot of times uncreative set of artistic choices that they would use to get to that point. And I think it's only recently that we've kind of seen that being pushed back, or at least that weighing in a certain sense. I mean, I can think of one that was, I don't know, 6 to 8 months ago, Dean Kissick, when he wrote an article about identity politics in art and all of the pushback that got. But he also got kind of championed by a lot of the big people in the industry. I think it's ironic because a lot of these art world industry heads were the biggest proponent of this political template as a means to create a career. And then all of a sudden, when somebody had the balls to say, yeah, no, this kind of sucks and we're like totally over this, they completely flip a switch because they intrinsically knew that it was fake and false and that it was making bad art. And now they're given the green light to do it. And so I don't know, it's like totally uncourageous, but that's another story. But that's an example in the art world. And obviously there's been, you know, a run of anti-cancel culture type films that have come out within the last 5 years as well. You know, the movie Tar, I think Eddington is, you could argue it's kind of a both sides. But there's been a number of these sort of what you could call quasi anti-cancel culture films that have come out, kind of signaling the end of that era. I want to again go back to the new Hollywood directors, because the new Hollywood directors in a lot of way they were responsible for a lot of good in the industry. Prior to them, and prior to the French New Wave and a lot of those European directors, film really wasn't looked at as a self-sufficient medium. It was really looked at as this sort of lower art form. And with the Cahiers du Cinema, those film directors that kind of repurposed and reimagined what an auteur was, the idea that a film or a director is someone that shapes the vision of it and that is an art form in and of itself, they were really responsible for that. And so the new Hollywood directors looked at that as a form of inspiration, saying, listen, we can treat this as a serious art form. And I think that did a lot of good. And you can see a lot of homage to those directors as well. You know, for the first time, directors are now looking back at another generation and taking from them and using that and integrating that language into their style. And that was great. It really, well, one, it created this through line in terms of the history of film, but it also was incredibly inspiring. You were able to take these little bits of wisdom from previous directors and use that to amplify your own film. Another thing was, because the Hays Code was lifted, they were able to approach filmmaking and infuse it with a certain type of reality that hadn't existed in it before. So it was closer to reality than probably anything people had ever seen before. And so it was incredibly jarring. It was incredibly effective at motivating audiences and moving them. Still to this day, you go back, you watch those films, they're incredibly moving films. And they are shot through with this reality, this like starkness. There's a stark truth in all of that work. And something that I think was, again, interesting is like we were talking about with the older generation not necessarily seeing filmmaking as a legitimate form of expression or not a form of high art. A lot of the writers during that generation really viewed screenwriting as a lesser form of expression. They viewed the novel as the ultimate form of writing, not screenwriting. That was a cheap way to make some money. But when they did take on screenwriting jobs, they treated it with the seriousness with which you would write a novel. And they took a lot of the sort of skills and the storytelling abilities from novel making and infused that into screenwriting, which is why there is such a strong form of narrative, especially in a lot of those older films. And the writing, there was a real obsession with writing. In a way, it gave it this sort of artificial nature. And I think that artificial quality is actually what made a lot of those movies so good. And now you have to contrast that with what we have now. Current contemporary filmmakers, when they go to write a script or they go to work on a script, they, unlike the previous generation where they're thinking about the script as a novel itself, a lot of them are trying to approach it by infusing it with as much reality as they can. And I think a perfect example of this is that movie Anora. When you go and watch it, you can tell that the screenwriter is trying to infuse all of those scenes with this sense of, oh my gosh, I'm there in this big screaming argument. And it's like I'm really there, where these conversations, there's nothing really poetic about them. They're just kind of screaming everywhere. In a way, it feels like a very self-conscious attempt at trying to make it as real as possible. But in a way, it's incredibly impotent and doesn't have that effect at all. I think the reason why it feels so impotent is because these filmmakers are competing with reality. Nothing is realer than the stuff that we're seeing on the internet now. You can't fake a fight scene that is realer than a fight that you're going to see on Twitter. You can't fake an argument better than an argument that you're going to see on Instagram. Okay? And so when you're trying to compete with technology and social media on that level, you are necessarily going to fail because it comes off as a cheap imitation of that. I can think of a litany of movies that try to compete on that level, that try to infuse technology or try to compete with technology on that level by trying to be realer than what is real. And you cannot do that. And you're going to make an impotent and ineffective film when you're approaching it like that. On the flip side, I think that really the strong suit is the artifice of filmmaking that is naturally its language. It can obviously have gritty realism infused into it, but it needs to be buttressed with the same sort of precision and care that scripts and films were made with back in the day. I think one of a perfect example of this, in my opinion, is the early opening scenes of Lawrence of Arabia.
Only two kinds of creature get fun in the desert: Bedouins and gods, and you're neither. Take it from me. For ordinary men, it's a burning, fiery furnace.
No, Dryden. It's going to be fun.
It is recognized that you have a funny sense of fun.
The way that people spoke in that, it's totally artificial. No one has ever spoke like that. It's totally, you could say it's pretentious, but it is an elevated form of speaking for the sake of the film. Another film that does that really well is Miller's Crossing. But these heighten it, and they make it into a sort of a fantasy in some way. And that's actually better. That's something that social media can't imitate well. It doesn't do that well. It doesn't do the long form, the slow, considerate, long form, poetic way that movies do. Its strong suit is the short, viral, intense moment. And when you try to compete, when those two try to compete, it's like a boxer and a wrestler getting in a ring and trying to fight each other. Like they're fighting on two uneven playing fields. Now, don't get too obsessed with that metaphor, but I think that can kind of work in this situation. And I think that this is proven because I think one form of evidence that proves this is look at one of the fastest growing categories, or at least last time I checked, one of the fastest growing categories was documentary filmmaking, which does successfully infuse both of those things, because documentary filmmaking is about capturing the present. It's about capturing what is real. And that's one of the only forms of filmmaking that I think can do that, which is why it's grown so much, because it does it better than anyone. There's a reason why Tiger King or Making of a Murderer, that you can't get realer than real, and that's capturing it. One other thing that I wanted to talk about is this sort of cinephile's approach to movie making. Because lately, I don't know if you guys feel like this, anytime you get online and you're in the cinephile universe, it feels like every filmmaker, every actor feels required to constantly wear a set of niche and obscure films on their sleeve, and to constantly boast about, well, this totally, I mean, it's a total meme now, this totally obscure film, this is the inspiration for my project, and this is totally infused and informed the language of it, and blah, 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 blah. You know, this feels like this new age affectation that has been born out of filmmakers like Tarantino, like PTA, like Scorsese. All those directors are great, but this is now kind of also being used as a template, which is, well, I can use this I can use this encyclopedic understanding of filmmaking to then create a collage with all of these disparate pieces, and then from that there will be this sort of unspoken energy that will make the film great. I see this a lot. I see this a lot with young filmmakers. They are completely obsessed with this, and it drives me nuts because, well, one, I always think back to that great Orson Welles. It was like a speech where he's talking about how filmmakers see too many films.
The more virgin our eyes are, the more we have to say. Now, of course, you must see films, and you must see great films. I said, don't be marinated. Don't soak yourself in films. And
yeah, I think that's true, because I was also looking at David Fincher's list of his favorite movies. You go and you look at them, it's like a total normie list of movies. It's like Baby's First Day at Film School movies that you would watch. And what I thought was so fascinating about that is, in a way, you could just watch those 12 or 20 whatever movies and get everything that you need. You don't need to see 100. There's this Polish guy and he made a film in a shed on 10 raspberries. Dude, you don't need to watch that. You can just watch Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago. You know, you can watch Citizen Kane. You can just watch Citizen Kane over and over again. You can get everything that you need from there. But I think in a lot of ways that comes out of this self-conscious performative element that the filmmaker has to do, which is, my film is not enough. And they fall into this, what I would call the record store guy problem of art making. And what I mean by that is, if you've ever gone into a record store, there's always the guy with the goatee with the encyclopedic understanding of every niche band in there. And if you were to ask that guy to make music, it would suck balls. It would suck. A perfect example of this, and I love Fred Armisen to death. He's a great comedian, but he's a terrible musician. And he's a terrible musician because he is obsessed with making sure that his art, or his music for that matter, is completely devoid of any cliches, that it cannot be cringe in any way. And the problem is great art knows when to infuse itself with cliches. And so if you have that encyclopedic record store guy approach to art making, and you're obsessed with avoiding cliches, and you're super hype, you're then removing yourself from the thing that is required in order to give yourself over to an artistic project. It isn't up to you to avoid cliches. It's up to you to be open and willing to make a piece of art, to embrace that, and to know when and what to use. But when you turn it into this rational sort of puzzle that you're trying to solve, what you end up making is some clunky. It may avoid all cliches, but it's going to be clunky, and it's not going to resonate with anyone. And to get back to Fred Armisen, I know I'm beating up on him. He's a great comedian, and I think he's a great comedian because he actually doesn't approach comedy that way. When you hear him talk about comedy, he doesn't have all of this, there was this joke teller in New York City and blah, 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 blah. He just has this intuitive sense for comedy, and he just leans into it. He doesn't care if it's cringe or not. But when it comes to music, you can tell. And this is why he's so good at riffing on musicians. And that's something that those type of people are good at, is they can riff and talk shit, and they can be a critic, but it makes it really hard for them to be an artist because of that. And that's one huge problem I see with filmmakers today, is that's how they approach filmmaking. It doesn't come from this intuitive standpoint. It comes from, I have to solve filmmaking like an equation, and I'm going to infuse it with all of these random esoteric references, and this is my inspiration. And it makes it a complete contrived mess. Yeah, and so I think, to kind of recap, it's kind of a culmination of a multitude of things. I think a lot of what people like Tarantino are talking about, that the industry isn't taking as many chances on young directors, that they do prioritize the franchise over the small indie film. But it's also that for a long time if there was an indie film being made, it was understood that you were making a sort of politically oriented or unspoken politically oriented film, which was didactic, reductive, boring, predictable in and of itself. So breaking away from that tendency, I think, is a way to help. But being sure not to go in the opposite direction, which is that making an anti-cancel culture film, or simply infusing your film with a bunch of un-PC stuff, isn't going to create a great film. You're just going to have something that's super inflammatory, that's unsavory, and unlikable. That's not going to necessarily make a movie that's good. If you are going to make something that's unsavory, it has to be in service of the truth, or it has to be in service of a higher vision, something that's expansive or transcendent. You can't just, make a piece of inflammatory piece of shit and hope that it's going to, go into the great pantheon of legendary movies. And so that had to be said, but also recontextualizing or rethinking this approach to competing with social media, thinking about your film and the strengths and the language of filmmaking in relationship to social media, and what are the strong suits of film and what are the strong suits of internet culture that maybe you want to avoid when you're creating the film to make a more potent and effective movie. And so I think really the silver lining here is the stakes are so low, films are so bad, that anyone that would implement any of this, or anyone that is a courageous, unique, brave filmmaker, they can really make a name for themselves. They can really stand out and create a career that will stand the test of time and really inspire people too. And so I think that that's the exciting part. So a lot of negative, but we're going to end it on a high note. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. Love y'all. Peace.